Hey, welcome back to Planet Hex. I'm Andrew Horns. I know I said I was going to retire back in December 2025, but I got bored. You know, these things happen. There's only so much time you can fill with stuff like this. Or indeed this. A big shout out to my friend Haley, aka Bunny Moonstone, here on YouTube for a lot of advice, some cool chats that have really reinvigorated my love of doing this. And I want to come back and talk to you more about VHS, the right in life VHS culture around the world, weird cult films, music, games, comics, stuff. I've got a lot to share with you over the coming months, years, and eons. So if you're not familiar with me, I wrote these books like VHS Ate My Brain and VHS Ate My Brain 2 The Revenge. I'm the originator of the VHS Ate My Brain column in Scream Horror magazine. I write for horrornews.net. I've written stuff for movies, for Doctor Who and Judge Dredd comics. I've written for AC Comics in the States for things like Femforce, Super Babes, and my own title, Violet Shadow. And big nerd, really. I am in Nottingham here in the UK, and I like talking about weird stuff. So, without further ado, what better to talk about than one of my greatest passions ever, and I know something that is shared by you guys here on my channel, the appeal of 80s horror. So what is it about 80s horror movies that just keeps on being appealing to new audiences? Is it nostalgia related? Can't be really for new audiences unless it's about nerds like me talking endlessly about why they love 80s horror so much. And what did that era bring us? It brought us, for one thing, icons. Icons of the genre like, of course, Freddy Krueger, here played by Robert Englund, the only Freddy Krueger really, in Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors, one of the best examples of the entire decade, to be honest. It also brought us less wisecracking characters like Jason Voorhees. It also brought us more fun from Sam Raimi in the shape of Evil Dead, Evil Dead 2, and so on. And they transformed the horror genre. They brought it a new freshness and excitement to this genre. Later on, you got Clive Barker bringing us Hellraiser. There was also things like little sidesteps that didn't really have a particular character to them, but were nonetheless iconic for a number of reasons, such as Creepshow, written by Stephen King, directed by George A. Romero. What a pairing! What a pairing that is! But as well as all the icons and the really well-known characters, there were lesser franchises that were no less entertaining, thanks to the rise of the video store. Now, one of the appeals of 80s horror is completely linked to the video store. It leveled the playing field between big budget movies and low budget movies and no budget movies, even SOV movies, shot on video films that were made for almost nothing. As long as you had a cool cover, you could pretty much get it in anywhere, in like the mom and pop stores and the independent video stores. That all came to an end when Blockbuster came along and ruined everything. But you know, you could get things like Subspecies from Empire Pictures, became Full Moon. You could get Killer Clowns from Outer Space, one of the most fun examples of 80s horror movies. You could get Neon Maniacs, that has an amazing cover but no plot. You could even get things like my beloved Trick or Treat, which is just a glorious, glorious thing. But why? Why are these things enduring? There are things about these movies that people love. The music, the aesthetic, the stars in them, the effects, the gore, how they went too far. But what does it really break down to? So let's start with the aesthetic. Here was an era of movies where you could get big hair, big monsters, big amounts of rubber and latex, and Vaseline and fake blood flying in all directions at once. It took the early eras, there was, in the 60s there was Night of the Living Dead, in the 70s that brought us things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Exorcist, and all these iconic titles that have become really serious parts of cinema. Then you've got the 80s and everything went completely insane. You have examples like Return of the Living Dead starring the marvellous Linnea Quigley as Trash, and the punk rock attitude of that with its just anarchic nature and the ridiculous amounts of ooze and naked, the zombies and Tarman and the gore. And there's the music. These things have iconic soundtracks. Things like the Trick or Treat one, for example, with all the songs on it being played in the movie by the character of Sammy Kerr. Or you've got things like the Nightmare on Elm Street soundtrack with the theme tune by Dokken on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors. You've got things like Billy Idol showing up on these things. There are iconic songs on each of these soundtracks that are just unforgotten to this day. How can anyone forget things like the sound effects from Friday the 13th of Jason Voorhees, but also the songs in those like Man Behind the Mask by Alice Cooper from Jason Lives, Friday the 13th Part 6. Yep, there are bad entries in any series, but there's still enjoyment to be had in these things. And the appeal of 80s horror is down to, I know I've said it's down to many things, but there was just this atmosphere of anarchy and a lack of rules. If you look at movies like Reanimator, where there are people being attacked by innards, or things like The Video Dead, where zombies are emerging from a TV. How can you not love that? In the video era, you had to have a gaudy cover if you wanted your cheap-ass horror movie to be noticed by anyone, and if companies had bought things from overseas and repackaged them, again, they would need an eye-catching cover. That did lead to some instances where the cover had nothing to do with the movie. Say if an old title from 10 years earlier had been bought and repackaged in the 80s, it would have a gaudy cover that was far beyond what the actual film delivered. You were going to get something that was made with, jars of jam, marmalade, jam, syrup, honey, that sort of thing. Sticky substances, that sounded wrong. I'll leave that in anyway, oh well. The cult movies of that era, they literally didn't take themselves that entirely seriously because they couldn't. With budgets like that, and you got ghoulies and things like that, and it's literally someone shaking a puppet to make it like it's alive, or you've got killer robots in chopping mall going around blowing people's heads up. It's not an era that ever really took its tongue out of its cheek. They had limited resources, limited budgets, limited amounts of cast and crew that could work on them. So when you go into something like Robot Ninja or 555 or Cannibal Campout, you know what you're going to be in for. The appeal of 80s horror was in its lack of self-consciousness to me, and the feeling of fun that you knew you were going to get from pretty much whatever you rented. But yeah, that's it to me. Let's see what people say about 80s horror online. So a quick Google search of 80s horror brought up everything you need to know about why that era is so loved by fans, fans that were there back in the day and fans even now here in the distant future of 2026 still love 80s horror movies. Here on IMDb there's a list of 100 horror films from the 80s, possibly the best decade for horror cinema. And of course it's got big names on there to start with, like The Shining and The Thing. Of course those are on there. Elm Street, The Blob, oh god, the Blob remake, that was amazing. The Entity, Cujo, Aliens, Pet Sematary, Ghostbusters, fair enough, and Predator in the top 10. But there's also like the remake of The Fly, one of the best remakes ever. There's some great stuff on this list. This is a really good shopping list. It gets you all the silly ones that I really like, and the serious ones as well. There's Return of the Living Dead. Next to Near Dark. Near Dark is one of the best vampire movies ever made, if not the best vampire movie ever made, and I stand by that. It is awesome. There's a lot of things to enjoy throughout that whole era, and it's going to take a long time for anyone not familiar with it to run out of stuff to watch. Over on Rotten Tomatoes, there's another list of 100 best 80s horror movies. Very different top 10 to the others. Some regular ones that you'd imagine, but then there's some really dark ones. Look at that for a pairing there. Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer next to Evil Dead 2. The variety of that era was just unreal. Again there, Poltergeist, They Live, and Gremlins.
fantastic. People seem to forget that the Gremlins did have a horror element to it. It's not as cutesy as you might imagine, so do revisit the old one. So we've got 7 crazy cult 80s movies you may have missed over on Flickering Myth. Let's see what's on this list. I'm curious to see what we may have forgotten about. I see Killer Clowns there. So there's Dead End Driving. Fair enough. Dr. Caligari. Yeah, I love the original Das Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The remake is very, very odd. Very, very odd. It's sort of a sequel, sort of part remake. It's an odd one. What else is on here? Killer Clowns from Outer Space, of course. Hell Comes to Frogtown. Over on Slash Film, there's a list here of 36 of the best 80s horror movies ranked. I saw one listed that was the greatest 80s horror movies of all time. Shouldn't that just be like, of the 80s? Does that count as all time as well? I don't know. But there's Freddy, Sleepaway Camp. If you know, you know. I'm not spoiling the end of the first Sleepaway Camp for you, but do watch that movie. Great slasher, great ending. What else have we got? Scanners. See, I forgot to mention stuff like sci-fi horror, such as Scanners and Videodrome and stuff like that. Scanners is one of my favourites of all time, and not because of the infamous exploding head. Fright Night and Fright Night 2. But yeah, definitely watch those. Not the remakes. Again, not a big fan of the remakes. But there's, Jesus, Tetsuo the Iron Man. Don't watch that late at night and don't watch it drunk because you will wake up a different person. Not in the same sense as Tetsuo, though. We've got here over on It's Only a Movie, best 80s horror films you could rent on video. These are the ones that would always get rented out. Let's have a look, see what they've got here. Cannibal Holocaust, that's the 70s movie, but I'll let you off. The Burning, great slasher, bit Friday the 13th-ish, but much more gory. Evil Dead, of course. Do check all these pieces out. But it shows you there is a lot of love for the 80s as an era for horror cinema. And there is also a lot of people talking about why 80s horror was terrible, but shut up. There's a great Reddit thread here of what made 80s horror so good, talking about the aesthetics, the music, the styles, especially the practical effects, and how the cinematography of these things had to work around the practical effects being hidden, because you didn't want them to, show up that they were just rubber. But you could tell they were just rubber by looking at them. And finish up on this example over on The Film Magazine, why the 80s is the best decade for horror. There's a lot out there that goes into this in detail, but these things were fun. And for people like me, it was my era. These are things that I grew up with. These are things that I collected. Far younger than I should have been doing, but hey, it was a very different era. These things do not take themselves as seriously, and they are not, while things are gory and violent, for the most part, they are not just completely nihilistic, unless you're watching things like Cannibal Ferox, Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, Deadbeat by Dawn, things like that. There was an atmosphere of, there was a party atmosphere that went hand in hand with the crazy soundtracks and the crazy creatures that were on screen.
So tell me, what's your favourite 80s horror movie down in the comments? Do you have a favourite franchise? Do you have a favourite studio? I'm Andrew Horn. I'm really glad to be back. I've really missed doing this and making these things for you guys. Thank you for watching Planet Hex.